Hi everyone. Thank you for joining our next installment of our monthly webinars. This one is titled Getting It Right, Refinement of SEN Validation Rules. Just to quickly introduce myself, my name is Kristin Kelly. I am a principal consultant at Pinnacle 21. I've been there almost 3 years now. I have more than 10 years experience at both pharma and CROs, working primarily in SEND and SDTM. I am heavily involved in FUSE and CDISC. Specifically with CDISC, I'm on the SEND core team, I'm on the SDS team, and I am a voting member of the global governance group within CDISC that approves new standards before they're published or go out for public review. I'm an authorized trainer for CDISC and SDTM, and I work on several FDA projects in both CBER and CDER that are clinical and non-clinical. If at any time during this webinar, if you have a question, please put it into the chat feature. I will answer as many questions as I can by the end of our time. Any questions that I don't answer, I'll answer after this session. So just a quick update from our previous Pinnacle 21 webinar. Confusing Validation Rules Explained. Michael Beers gave this presentation on April 30th of this year. We had almost 2,000 attendees. We had 232 questions that were asked, and so we are actively working on answering those. So please stay tuned for future blog posts for those responses. Thank you so much for joining this webinar. So why refine the SEN rules at all? Or really the question is, why should I validate my data at all? Well, the short answer is FDA is going to check it too. So when a submission is received at FDA, it's run through FDA DataFit, which is the FDA's instance of Pinnacle 21 Enterprise. Also, if a non-clinical reviewer requests a Kickstart service, the data will be run through FDA DataFit. That analyst will review it, and they will provide any findings based on the validation report or any manual findings that they come across to the non-clinical reviewer. So that's why it's really important that we have a robust rule set that can be as automated as possible, because it will reduce a lot of the manual checking that has to be done. And so that is why we have worked really hard to try to refine that SEN rule set. So both clinical and non-clinical data are based on the same set of variables and metadata in the SDTM model. Though they share the same variables, they're implemented differently for clinical versus non-clinical. So when we're preparing our submission deliverables, the conformance to CETA standard is usually done by automated validation tools such as Pinnacle 21. All of these validation rules are based on FDA business rules, CETIS rules, or other data quality rules that Pinnacle 21 has decided are useful for a reviewer, so that they don't have to do that manual checking. Though there are several similarities in conformance to SDTM and SEND, there are also several differences that need to be accounted for in validation. So that is why we have been refining the rules over the past year by modifying existing rules, removal of others, or creating new ones. So the first is changes to existing rules. We have a lot of rules that are assigned to both SDTM and SEND. We have 3 major categories for why we would change existing rules. So we have rules that are updated for both standards, both SDTM and SEN, that they both apply. We've created new SEN-specific versions of an existing rule, or we remove rules that were not applicable for SEN at all. Just a little background into the rule metadata for the Pinnacle 21 rules. All of our rule IDs have a 2-letter designation for what standard it applies to. So for Atom, you have AD in the prefix followed by a 4-digit number. SDTM rules have SD, and SEN only rules have SE. So whenever you see an SD rule, it's an SDTM rule. It can be applied for SEN if it's based on conformance to the model, or it's a concept that's identical between the IGs. If you see a rule prefix that has SE in it, it's only applicable for SEN. So our first example of changes to existing rules is SD 11117. So this rule will fire when we have duplicate records in findings domain where the same test is done for the same subject at the same time point. So over the years, we have consistently updated this rule by adding qualifier and timing variables to it, so to reduce the amount of false positives that are firing. Please note that the rule logic does not include variables that can be sponsor defined, like things like SPID, ref ID, link ID, etc. You should be explicitly explaining what these variables, how they are assigned in your define or your reviewer's guide. So that this is the reason why we don't have them in the rule logic for SD 1117. So if this rule fires and this is the only difference between the records in your data set, then you need to explain that in your reviewer's guide. Over time, we've added many variables that have historically been more often used in SEND, and this is a list here. So we have anatomical region, directionality, portion totality, visit day, end day, start time of assessment interval, end time of assessment interval, or nominal day. Additionally, we have updated the rule description to be more generic because the original one was very specific where it just mentioned no finding result with the same test code for the same subject for the same DTC. Like, we are very specific about naming those variables. And in the new rule description, we mentioned still test code for the same qualifier variables to account for all those qualifiers we've added to the rule logic at the same time point to account for all of those timing variables for the same subject. The next change we've made was to SD 0006, no baseline flag and domain for subject. So in the FDA Technical Conformance Guide, baseline flags are requested for both clinical and non-clinical data, where you have at least one record per test that has a baseline flag value of Y for yes. So for SDTM, there's a handful of domains, EG, LB, MB, MS, PC, and VS. For SEN, it's only EG, LB, and VS. But we had the same rule. So it was one rule for both standards, but it returned false positive messages for SEN domains other than EG, LB, or VS. Also, the rule description was very SDTM focused. As you see here, we have all the SDTM domains listed out that don't apply for SEND. We also mentioned screen failures, not assigned subjects, and not treated subjects. These concepts do not exist in SEND, And so it's confusing to look at that rule description and see that on a SEN study. So we removed it. So what did we replace it with? We replaced it with SE 2319. No baseline flag and domain for subject. It's the same message, but it's SEN specific now. So you'll see that the rule ID has SE in it because it's SEN only. No baseline flag record and domain for subject. You'll notice that we only assigned it for EG, LB, and VS, so the rule logic only checks those 3 domains. And we also removed the verbiage about screen failures and not treated subjects, etc. That was very clinically focused. We also modified the rule logic so that it would not fire if there was no data in a specific domain for a subject, which is a little different from how SD0006 works. It's more important in clinical about the baseline flags, whereas it's more technical with non-clinical. The next set of changes, SE 2305 through SE 2308. We also created a new rule, SE 2318. Missing values for all required timing variables needed for summarization. This is based on FDA Business Rule 47 that says required timing variables for identification of the day on which group summaries, group means, and incidences are calculated should be populated for non-clinical data. So these rules check that specific timing variables needed for group summaries are populated in the applicable SEN data set. So some of these timing variables are the DY, the actual study day, the start day, STDY, visit DY if you're using SEN 3.0, or nominal day if you're using SEN 3.1. We've had these rules for a number of years. The old rule logic used to check also reference start date, but because only a couple of them are based on the actual day, that's already like DY and STDY, that's already part of the derivation of those variables. Now we just check the actual value in the domain that they're populated at all. So here are the updated rule messages and descriptions for these rules for missing values for all required timing variables. You'll notice that for SE 2305, it's only for the DS domain. 2306 checks a number of findings domains. SE 2307 checks those timing variables that use DY and ENDY most often, like body weight gains and food and water consumption. 2308 and 2318 check PC and PP. SD 1078, permissible variable with missing value for all records. This rule has been around for a long time. It's a data quality rule to check variables that are permissible, that as indicated in the implementation guide. And it'll fire if all the values are null in the data set. So this fires a lot for send because typically the tool that's being used to collect all the data for that particular study is the same tool that's producing the SEN data sets. And so there's really no concept of mapping. And so a lot of times those permissible variables are still included and not dropped from the data set. So this rule will fire a lot in send. So considering, looking at the SDTM IG and the SEN IG, there's really no directive that you have to drop these or keep them. As long as you didn't collect any data to populate them. So permissible doesn't mean that if you collect data, you can choose to submit it or not. Any data that you collect should be submitted. But if you don't have any data to submit in the permissible variable, it's a sponsor decision whether you should drop it or keep it. So based on all this information, Pinnacle 21 decided to downgrade this rule to a notice for SDTM, and we completely removed it for send, because typically all of the permissible variables are included in the data set. Moving on to new rules, we created several new rules for the trial summary domain. So Pinnacle 21 already includes rules that are listed in the send IG that are designated as Y for should include for both versions, send 3.0 and send 3.1. And so if you look here, this is just a snippet from the send IG, and there's that should include parameter column. We created several new rules based on what's in the FDA Technical Conformance Guide. Most of these are listed in the send IG, but they're just not designated as should include in the implementation guide, but here in the Technical Conformance Guide, they're considered FDA desired. Please note that we created a rule for any parameter designated as Y in the TCG. We did not include any that are considered conditional. So if it's FDA desired, then it's expected that there is a record for that particular parameter in TS. And here is a list of all the new rules we created. Also, please notice that the rule ID has SE in it, meaning that it's send only. So other new rules that we created based on FDA business rules, starting with version 1.4 of the FDA business rules, there were several new rules that were added for non-clinical. A lot of those had to do with tumor.xpt, but we did add some others that were checking send data sets. So the first one is FDA Business Rule 82. Which states that for carcinogenicity studies, MI-ResCat should be populated unless MI-stress-C has a value of unremarkable if you're using SEN 3.1 or normal for SEN 3.0, or MI-stat has a value of not done. So based on this business rule, we created these two rules. The first one is SE 2228, which the message is there's a missing MI-ResCat value when stress-C is not normal, unremarkable, or null, or stat is not done. And then we created an inverse rule, SE2233, ResCat should not be populated when stress-C is normal, unremarkable, or null. So just to look at an example of SE2228, here is the rule message here with the description. We have a publisher ID of FDA B82. Down at the bottom is our actual data, and you'll see here that we do not have a result of normal, unremarkable, or null, and we have a missing MI result category value. The next new rule that we created based on FDA business rules was FDA Business Rule 85. For findings in MI-stress-C using the neoplasm control terminology list, malignancy status, and MI-ResCat, should align with any benign or malignant designation in neoplasm. Explain any inconsistencies in the non-clinical study data reviewer's guide. So based on this business rule, we created SE2229 for MI, or microscopic findings, that this rule will fire when stress C or ResCat has a mismatch when the ResCat is benign or malignant. So looking at an example for SE2229, you'll see down at the bottom here, these first two records in MI stress C, we have values of benign, but then MI ResCat has values of malignant. You'll also see in this screenshot that the rule will fire regardless of the case, the casing of the characters. So like further down, we have benign in lowercase and we have malignant in title case, and the rule still returned a result. Another rule based on FDA business rules, FDA business rule 65, DS, CL, EG, EX, LB, MA, MI, PC, PP, and VS should be submitted if collected. So because of this business rule, we already had two rules that were assigned for SDTM for a long time that checked for a missing EX data set for exposure or a missing disposition data set. So even though we're not looking for all of those domains listed in the business rule because it's really based on the study design. You know, every study is always going to need to have an exposure data set in SEND because the subject has to be dosed, and then there always needs to be a disposition data set, or DS. So we added those two rules for that. Other new rules that we've added, SD 1352, duplicate records in domain. So we already have the infamous SD 11117, which checks duplicate records and findings domains. We also have SD 1201 that checks for duplicate records in events domains. And that is assigned in SEND for the DS domain. That's the only events domain in SEND. But we never had a rule for interventions. We don't know why. I think it's just an oversight. So by popular demand, we have created SD 1352 that checks for duplicate records in interventions domains. And it checks against a list of different qualifiers. You know, you have our topic variable treat, cat, SCAT route, location, treatment vehicle, within the same subject and start date. So we now have duplicate records checks for all three of the general observation classes. We've also created some data quality checks for the stint and int variables in the pharmacokinetics parameters domain, or PP. So the first rule is SD 1348, where it is checking that stint and int are populated when the PP test references T1 to T2. So we have a lot of controlled terminology for PP test. And when it describes a time interval, it's described in NCI controlled terminology as T1 to T2, where T1 is the start of the interval and T2 is the end of the interval. And then that interval is supposed to be represented in the start time of assessment interval and end time of assessment interval variables in the PP domain. So if you're looking for the area under the curve of 0 to 24 hours, you would have AUC interval T1 to T2 in your PP test. And then in ISO 8601 format, you would have PT0H in your planned start of assessment interval variable, and then PT24H in your PPENINT variable. So SD1348 is checking for that. And then we created a couple other rules, SD1350, that when one or the other is not populated, this rule will fire. So if you're missing like planned of end of assessment interval, that you have the start and vice versa. So that's what SD1350 and 1351 are checking. Other improvements that we've made, we've updated our existing rules for trial summary to also check trial sets for the TX domain. This is because they share the PARM code and PARM code lists, as well as conventions and formats for populating TS val and TX val for each parameter. I have an example here of, date parameters have to be in ISO 8601 format. You have other parameters like age that needs to be an integer, and so we have updated those rules to also check TX. There have also been codeless additions and changes for variables between versions of the SendIG. So one example of where we've updated our metadata was for VS ORESU and VS StressU. So between Send 3.0 and Send 3.1, it changed from VS RESU code list to the unit code list. So we've updated that in our metadata. Another example is MI Stress C in Send 3.1 uses both the neoplasm and non-neo code lists, whereas in Send 3.0 it only uses neoplasm. So we've updated that for Send 3.1. And then also for VS test code and test code list changed to Send vital signs test code and test code lists. So we've also updated that. In development, recently CDISC has published some new standards, one of them being the Send 3.0 conformance rules. We are actively working on implementing those into our system. Also, the Send animal rule implementation guide was added to the data standards catalog, and we are actively working on adding that standards metadata to our system. Also, there were several FDA business rules that are asking to check the traceability between tumor.xbt and Send datasets. And so we are working on some rules that'll check that traceability. We also have been creating along the way some useful data quality checks that have been requested by FDA, mostly for the FDA non-clinical core data fitness reports. So core data fitness reports are reports that are reviewer friendly. They're not so much standards, doesn't have like a lot of standards language in it, but there are checks and reports that are provided to non-clinical reviewers so they can better understand the data. And so we've added some data quality checks that not necessarily tied to compliance, but are helpful in review. So just to summarize, historically, development of validation rules for Send has lagged behind SDTM. We have been working on refining it against the guidance in the SendIG and also the FDA business and validator rules. To fully utilize the updated SEN rules, I would recommend always using the most recent version of Pinnacle 21 software, whether it be enterprise or community. I have seen a lot of submissions where, community version 2.2 is still being used, and that is a very old version of the rules. It's from 2016. So please, if you're not an enterprise customer, please use the most recent version of community. And that brings us now to some questions. So let me look really quickly. Okay, some questions. So the first question is, can you send me slides of this webinar? Will the recording for this webinar be available? So both the slides and the recording will be made available in the next few days. You will receive an email as a follow-up to this webinar with the link where you can access those, and they'll also be posted on the website, pinnacle21.com. The next question is, what about PMDA plans to request SEN data? Well, I know that PMDA is considering the requirement for SEN data, but I'm really not sure of the timeline for that. I would recommend to send this question along to the PMDA. Next question, why can't I find any validation configurations under PMDA engine SEN standard? Well, this is because PMDA does not currently accept SEN submissions. So whether you're working in enterprise or community, you will not see a Pinnacle 21 engine that has PMDA as a label for send configuration. Next question is, where can I find a list of trial summary parameters needed for FDA submissions? As I showed many slides ago, these are listed as an appendix in the FDA Technical Conformance Guide. Next question, should I explain only validation errors or all issues including warnings? Well, all issues that fire in the validation report should be explained in the non-clinical study data reviewer's guide. Errors should be rectified if they can be, but if they're not, if they're due to some data oddity, then I would recommend that there be a thorough explanation provided in the NSDRG. But I would definitely explain both errors and warnings. Next question, how can I clarify rule algorithms or suggest improvements for Pinnacle validation? If you're a community user, you can direct all questions and suggestions to our public forum on our website. If you're using enterprise, you can submit a ticket to our service desk and you will most likely get me or one of my colleagues, but probably me, to answer your questions. Either way, it's really helpful to us when you guys send us your suggestions and comments and questions, because it helps us improve the tool and it helps us improve the rules. So please feel free to send those along to us. Where can I find a list of all validation rules for SEND? Pinnacle 21 rules can be found on our website at pinnacle21.com. They're also listed in each validation report on the Rules tab. And then if you're looking for CDISC and FDA business rules, you can go to their websites, either cdisc.org or fda.gov. I'm going to take a couple more questions. The next one is, recently FDA had added animal rules study data sets into FDA standards catalog. What are Pinnacle's plans to support validation of this data standard? Well, as I mentioned, we are currently working on implementing this new standard. It will be available in a future major release of Enterprise. What major release that is, I do not know. Timing of this release into community will be a little bit different. It's usually dependent on when CDISC publishes rules for that particular standard. But once we have a beta version of it, it will be an Enterprise. And I'm going to take one more question. What is the advantage of using Enterprise versus community for SEND? Okay, so one advantage of using Enterprise is that Enterprise is always going to have the latest versions of the rules in there. And so it will mirror what the FDA sees when they receive your submission, when they run it through DataFit. Community tends to lag behind a little bit, just because, it's an open source tool, and that's, we will put out the standards when CDISC or FDA publishes their rules for it. Another advantage of having Enterprise is the define.xml tool that we have. It's probably the best tool that I've ever used. It will validate your define in real time as you're working on it. It also ensures that it'll be conformant with the define.xml standard as closely as possible. And that is a huge advantage, to have a compliant define.xml that'll readily load into other review tools, like, whatever FDA review tool they're using, like Janus nonclinical or what have you. So that's another advantage. So I think that is all the time that we have. So I'm going to close this session. Thank you so much for joining. Any questions that I did not get to, I will provide you a response after this webinar. Again, thank you so much for joining. Have a good day.